Thank you everybody for being here. My name is Ajit Sahi. I'm the moderator for the evening. Thank you, Ms. Moitra, Member of Parliament for being here. Thank you, Siddharth Varadarajan for being here. This is a great gathering here. Thank you all for coming here in this cold winter. I'm coming from Washington, D.C. It's not so cold there. It's much colder here. Let me start with you, Ms. Moitra, because time is of the essence here. We have a hard stop at 7:15. You've given two very important speeches in Parliament. One was last week, and the other was shortly after the elections results were announced and the government won the election. And in both your speeches, there's plenty of material to come back to you on this. But in both speeches, on both occasions, you referenced Germany of the 1930s. This time you've spoken about the Auschwitz, and you spoke the last time also about what was happening at that time in that country. You said, if I recall from that speech, there's a powerful and continuing nationalism being seared into our national fabric. It is superficial, it is xenophobic, and it is narrow. This was your first speech 6-7 months ago. I would like to ask you more about how do you mean superficial? What do you mean by superficial? Xenophobia one can understand, narrow of course one can see, but superficial is something that really caught my eye.
First, hello everyone, and it's wonderful to see a full-packed house here, and thank you again for inviting me. There are two things I would like to set up front. One is that this is a closed-door event from what I understand, so I hope there's no immediate telecast of this on any channel or anything. That's the first. And the second is that in India, I am a member of the opposition. I speak in Parliament, I fight in the streets, I stand against the government in elections, but on foreign soil, it is my government. So I will not make personal attacks against anyone. I would urge everyone in the audience not to agree on to make personal attacks or to make anything like that. That's not something I would like to go down. So with that caveat, let me start. When we say superficial, to me, patriotism is something that is, I think, in all of us. And the reason we're sitting here today is because we love our country and Siddharth as I do. But to be a patriot is also to have the freedom to criticize. And I think what's happening now in India, especially over the last 5 years, is that it is, a lot of people have seen it in the US with Bush, they are with us or against us. And this is something that is a global thing for the last 5 to 7 years. And in India too, it's if you criticize, it's sort of the extreme form of either you're with us or against us. So patriotism is being defined as if you don't do X, there's a test of everything. So if you speak out, you're not a patriot. There is no freedom to criticize a lot of things. And I think that kind of homogeneity is not something that we were used to as Indians. It's certainly not an India that we grew up in. So that's what I feel when I say it's superficial, because it's like if you're saying you're going to be a good Hindu, you can lie, you can cheat, but if you go and bathe in the Ganges and you do puja once a day and you think you're a good Hindu, then to me that's being superficial. So similarly, I think if you're being patriotic or you're doing everything that's anti-constitutional, but if you say that we hate Pakistan, and that's all it takes to be nationalist, then I think that's being superficial. So I think that we have to be careful to define patriotism and to define love for our country and nationalism as something which is much broader than sort of a 5-tick test.
It's interesting that you talk about dissent and the response to dissent. We've seen just very recently, in fact yesterday the news came out that a doctor from Gorakhpur, who has in the last 2 years become quite a bit of a social activist, he was arrested for speaking out against the Citizenship Amendment Act, and then he was given bail 3 days ago, and we just discovered a few hours ago actually that he has now been detained under NSA for criticizing the Citizenship Amendment Act. Would that qualify as a superficial understanding of dissent?
No, that's not exactly what I meant by superficial understanding of dissent. That's not what I meant by a superficial understanding of nationalism. It was something a little deeper than that. These are cases everywhere, not just here, but in the US and all over the world. We do see cases like this where people speak up and there's some kind of act or the other that is thrown in. This is not new to anyone. So I won't use this one example. I haven't heard of it because I've been traveling, but I won't use this one example to point out that yes, that's superficial. When I said superficial, I meant the superficial idea of nationalism or hyper-nationalism is what I was referring to.
Okay, thank you. Siddharth, the next question comes to you. Continuing with this trend that we are talking about, what do you think is happening in terms of dissent? I mean, the publication that you were in has been in the forefront of speaking the truth to power and writing reports and investigating, which a lot of the criticism has come the way of the Indian media, that they have not, in fact, her own speech in Parliament spoke about how the media is now belongs to just one organization, one business house. How do you summarize the situation in India today, especially in the context of the protests that have gone on for the last 2 months in India?
Yeah. So I think there's no doubt that a major section of the media has surrendered its role of being what is conventionally known as the fourth pillar or watchdog. They don't believe in subjecting authority or government to critical examination, right? Which is the basic minimum that you expect of independent media in a democracy. And this section of the media sees its role rather as one of amplifying government policy and government prejudice, targeting the government's enemies and the government's opponents as if these are national enemies and traitors. And that's the role that they have arrogated to themselves, I would say largely on a voluntary basis, because nobody had compelled them to do this. There is a problem with dissent, and there is a problem of free speech in India, but the media is, I would say, a relatively privileged sector, because despite all the pressures that we face, for example, in the YSA, right, which take multiple forms, financial pressure, defamation, legal suits of one kind or the other, but we are still able to say and write what we want, and we are in a position to put up a hell of a fight if an attempt is made to silence us. But increasingly, whether it's on campuses, whether it's in cities and mohallas and qasbas where people try to exercise their democratic rights as citizens, that right to protest is getting, is being violated. In Uttar Pradesh, it takes great courage and bravery for the women who have gathered outside the clock tower, for example, to do so and to protest against the CAA when the manner in which the initial burst of dissent against the CAA was treated, right, in the middle of December, right? The arrest of S.A. Darakuri, or the arrest of Siddharth Jafar, simply for video recording of what was happening, and frivolous cases being filed against them. In Gujarat, it's virtually impossible. You have it now emerges that there's been continuous Section 144 for the past 18 years, banning public protests. And even in states ruled by the opposition, like Maharashtra, for example, the natural instinct of the police is to look at any protest with great suspicion.
In Telangana, Hyderabad police have denied permission for protests.
Exactly. So under the law of the land, you're meant to inform the police. You don't really require permission to protest. And so this is a problem. Campuses meetings aren't held. I've spoken after the dilution of Article 370. I've spoken on the Kashmir topic in many campuses, and very few of them are able to actually use the words Kashmir and 370 in the title of the seminar. And when I went to one seminar in a college in DU which said, the title was, what's the future of federalism in India? And I said, this is a very vague topic. And I don't know, why are you calling me for this vague topic? And they said, well, actually, and this is within a week of 370 being, diluted. And they said, well, actually the topic is on Kashmir, but we can't say it in the headline because then we won't get permission. And even if we get permission, the ABVP will disrupt and the police will say, it's go cancel karo. Right? So this is the sense in which we believe the right to dissent and free speech is under challenge. And of course, media that self-censors and simply chooses not to say things that they have the right to say.
You want to add something to
Yeah, just to add to what he was saying, and increasingly we've seen is for example, with 144 and with just having to inform police. Very often what's happened, and this is something unfortunately that's been a tradition in India, it happened under the emergency as well, so this is not something that's new to, and the current dispensation keeps throwing that back at us, saying that, how are we the West? This has already happened in the late 70s, so that somebody else did it, so we have the right to do it as well, is what is coming up every day is some kind of, allows them to get away with it. But if you see the role of the courts, for example, the Delhi High Court came down on the police for the Bhim Army chief for Delhi, and he says he doesn't need to, he can go and protest in the Jama Masjid. It doesn't make him a Pakistani, there's nothing wrong with it. He just needs to tell them that the police do not have the power to stop it. And Section 144 is not a tool in the hands of the government or a tool in the hands of the police to completely stop peaceful protest by civilians. And while both the Supreme Court and the High Court have made this, it doesn't seem to have changed very much, unfortunately.
Though we did see last month the Supreme Court Chief Justice say that the protests end first before we take up those cases. That has not gone down well with sections of protesters. I want to come back. You talked about the protests in Lucknow. Shaheen Bagh has become sort of an international icon now. We have stories about it here in the United States. I meet with members of Congress and their staffs in Washington, D.C. They know about Shaheen Bagh. That's the most interesting thing. You said in your speech earlier, in Parliament, you talked about that it has been targeted with the NRC and the Citizenship Amendment Bill. We are making sure that it is only one community that is the target of the anti-immigration laws. Now we see that community has, to the surprise of many people, I guess even to the surprise of the government of the day, has come out with such large numbers and is protesting, perhaps for the first time, with such defiance or with such confidence in 70 years. How do you see this process? What is your view of it?
I think the thing with the NRC and with the CAA is when I came out with my first speech, the NRC numbers weren't fully out. But when you see what's happened in Assam, out of 19 lakh people, there are 12 lakh Hindus in the list, right? There are 12 lakh Hindus in the list. There are lakh Gorkhas in the list. So it's not as though there are only Muslims in the list. So the constituency I represent and the state I come and the district I come from, Nadia, there are about 55 lakh people, of which 25 lakh are displaced Hindus from Bangladesh who've come over, and a lot of them have come over after 24th March 71, because if that was the cut-off date for the Bangladesh war in Assam, most displaced refugees come after that, and their children are married and they come later, and one brother comes over, then the other brother comes over. So Nadia today, most Muslims have come in 46, 47. The Hindu refugees are the ones which we've had these big refugee camps, Cooper's camp and a few others have all come. So there are about 22 to 25 lakh Hindus today. Now they were all from Bangladesh. And after the Assam NRC experiment, so to speak, it's the Hindus in Bengal that have actually got absolutely scared. And even if you tell them that, look, there's going to be this sieve of the CAA by which all Hindus will automatically be given citizenship, they can see what's happening in Assam, where you're going to have to go to these detention centers, you're going to have to go through a process, go through a 6-year process to get this. And what people fear more, especially the poor, because the rich, nothing will happen to the rich. It's going to be like demonetization where only the poor will suffer. And I don't think there's going to be any rich displaced person from anywhere who might have come from Bangladesh have to suffer, or from Pakistan have to suffer. It's the poor. And people don't like insecurity. So I think this is not, Shaheen Bagh is not only a Hindu phenomenon, a Muslim phenomenon. I don't think so. I think protests everywhere this is something we see people from all communities coming out, simply because, at least in Bengal, we've seen Bengali Hindus get absolutely scared about this. And we've seen, even in the Lok Sabha, the solid middle-class Hindu vote, which had gone to the current dispensation, slowly shift away, because I always give this example. I said the way Hindus and Muslims live in India is that I, as a Hindu parent, may not want my child to marry a Muslim, but at the same time, I don't want to kill my Muslim neighbor. There's a difference between the two. Right? So I think as long as those lines are okay, we're okay. But the minute those lines start getting blurred, then middle-class Hindus wake up thinking, hold on, I didn't give you the license to do this. And I think that's what is happening to a large part of middle-class India today.
Just to ask a very quick question before I come back to Siddharth. The government is very clear, they're not backing off the CAA despite the nationwide protests. Where do you see this headed?
We've heard this kind of rhetoric from the government before. When the NRC, for example, for the NRC, the Home Minister in Parliament stood up and said that we're going to do this everywhere. There's going to be an NRC in every state. 2 weeks after that, we had the Prime Minister say, who's talking about a nationwide NRC? We've never mentioned an NRC nationwide. And after the Cabinet Minister for Home in Parliament said that we're going to do an NRC in every state, we just had the Minister of State for Home, who's his junior, in Parliament stand up and say there is no current plan in in reply to a start question in Parliament, say that there's no current plan to have a nationwide NRC. So I think that that they've come out and they've been very clear is actually not that clear. So, so I don't think that this is something that is set in stone. I think we've heard very mixed noises from the government. We've heard
On
lots
CAA
of, well, on NRC, CAA is still very much up in the air. I mean, you just passed the bill, you have to remember. And to pass the bill and to operationalize it are two different things. So yes, it's already set in law now, so there's no going back, but there are a lot of laws that are not. So I haven't heard anything on the CAA in Parliament since we passed that. So that's something. And you've got to remember the different noises we've heard on the NRC. So I don't know what they're thinking about, whether they will decide to go slow or what it is, but the fact is that it's an act. I'm one of the people that have challenged the act in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has issued notice to the government and let it come up, and we'll see what happens.
That's great. You know, the question about the Modi government is from people who criticize it. And parts of her speech are also, where she says things like that. You're not being fair to the people who voted for you. She talked about how she was not in either the 31% or the 37%, but still the government is, so they're not answerable to her. The question is, how much of Modi's voters or Modi's supporters or Modi's electors have actually believed in this agenda, or how much of it was what she said in Parliament, that they wanted jobs and that's why they voted for you, and you are going back on that. What is your assessment as an independent journalist?
See, the truth is we don't really know, but if you look at the historically evolved BJP vote, reached its peak under Atal Bihari Vajpayee when he won roughly 21 to 20% of the electorate. Modi upped it to 31 in 2014. And it was widely assumed that the additional 10% that he brought to the BJP was the so-called aspirational voter. Who wanted jobs and so on and so forth. This 31% has now become 38% in 2019, despite the fact that he provided no jobs. Right? So either people are continuing to hold on to that mirage, or they are evaluating him in opposition to Rahul Gandhi, who's the other face. See, people vote for a variety of reasons, and I would say that we don't have enough evidence to, or we don't have enough we don't have enough, data to say whether Modi supporters are annoyed or happy about, say, a thing like the NRC or the CAA. But we can gauge from the dialing back of the NRC that Amit Shah and Modi are perhaps beginning to wonder whether they've bitten off more than they could chew. Right? If, as they suggest, and as they had intended, CAA was purely a game to polarize and to put pressure on Muslims and to disenfranchise perhaps eventually a section of Muslims. They know that word has spread that everybody will have to prove their citizenship, and poor people don't have the documentation to do that. The Assam example is before everybody. And despite all their attempts to somehow convince people that no Indian will be affected by this process, lots of people are deeply skeptical, and I'm sure many of them are Modi voters too, or have voted for Modi, or have illusions about him, or have faith in him. Right? So I think that we can read, and I think eventually even the CAA, I agree with you that the game is all over. Quite apart from the legal challenge, there's a lot more. I think that the protesters also have to read to. For example, one part that they have not adequately focused on is that the CAA, apart from being an assault on the idea of Indian citizenship, right, by introducing religion as the criterion, is also a highly dishonest refugee policy. India needs a refugee policy. And the CAA protesters often say that if there are Hindus who are forced to flee Pakistan, or if there are Sikhs who are forced to flee Afghanistan because of religious reasons, India should offer them safe haven. So India needs to have a humane refugee policy, but this is not that. Because recently there was a story about 26 families who were trying to cross the border and come from Pakistan to India. Well, bad news. The CAA will not help them. Right? So what kind of a refugee policy is this? One of the ministers tweeted when there was a story about a Hindu girl being forced to convert to Islam in Sindh. saying that now where are the critics of the CAA? Well, the CAA does not help her. So I think we need to make a noise about India needing a proper refugee policy. And a proper refugee policy cannot have a cut-off. And the BJP can never accept that, because the minute they dilute this cut-off, the whole of Assam will be up in flames. Because the cut-off has been introduced to somehow make the CAA palatable in Assam. And that has not worked. Even the 2014 cut-off has not worked for the BJP. But if you remove the cut-off, BJP knows it will have all hell to pay. So I think the campaign also has to focus on all of these different nuances. But I think that there's still plenty of fight left on this issue, and it will not be an easy thing for the BJP to be able to implement.
Go ahead.
One of the nuances about the NRC is if you look at the genesis of the NRC, the BJP is really caught in a catch-22. Because the Assam Accord, the NRC came from the Assam Accord. Now, we lived in Assam with children, and in Assam the problem was not against, the Assamese did not pull the Muslims out. You must understand, the Assamese had a problem more with Bengalis. So when Assam was, during partition, what had happened was that you had a very large part of Assam, which was Assam was a Hindu population state, but you had the province of Sylhet, which was a Muslim majority, a province which was part of Assam. So Gopinath Bordeloi, who was then chief minister in 46, said that there's a Sylhet referendum, we should have put it to referendum and let the people choose what you want to do. So most of Sylhet chose, the Muslim part chose to remain in Bangladesh, but 3.5 thanas, 3.5 police stations, more around the Silchar Karimganj area, which was the Barak Valley, chose to come into Assam. So you had this large Bengali population, originally from Bangladesh, but who chose to be in India. So 47, when India and then East Pakistan was created, these people were already there. Now, over time, the Assamese indigenous population started feeling like Bengalis are taking away their jobs, Bengali language is taking over indigenous Assamese language, all of those issues. So when the student, the ASU, the All Assam Students' Union, I think it was, started during the late 70s, 80s, it became a very violent agitation. It was called the Bangali Khedao Antidol, which basically translates to saying chase out the Bengalis. And Prafulla Mahanta and Rigu Phukan and Sarvananda Sonowal and all these guys were all very, I would say, very violent student leaders for this, agitating for this purpose. And when Rajiv Gandhi, after his mother died, became Prime Minister, he had Punjab on one side and Assam on the other, and he wanted peace at any cost. And I think at that point, signing the Assam Accord based on this was perhaps not the wisest thing to do. But the Assam Accord at that time was just to buy peace, and nobody thought that this would actually have to be operationalized at that point. And they said that, look, Bangladesh was created 24th March 71, anyone who's come after is going to be an illegal migrant, anyone who's come before. So you would set that date. Now, but obviously, when Sonowal and the others went to court, and as luck would have it, it came in front of the then Chief Justice of India, who was himself indigenous Assamese, whose father had also been chief, and who perhaps, I think in all fairness, should have recused himself from that bench, but didn't. And he took it upon himself to say that in 3 years we will operationalize this, we'll get the NRC going. So when they did this, they found that they had so many Bengalis. Now what happened in Assam was the Assamese were not happy with the NRC, because all of a sudden it was like there are so many, we wanted more people to be thrown out, so they weren't happy. The rest of India and the BJP's core voter base of Hindus were not happy because they were like the 12 lakh Hindus. So, in fact, some of the most violent and earlier CAA protests and the NRC protests were in Assam. I mean, 144 was in Guwahati for longer than anywhere else. So they basically got them into a situation where nobody's happy with this. And so
I would agree with you that
it's
a catch-22. Definitely for the BJP in Assam.
Absolutely.
Because they, and as you rightly said, they don't want Bengali-speaking people, Hindus or Muslims. So their opposition to the CAA is for fundamentally very different reasons than the rest of the
Yeah.
I want to come back to you. I want to ask you very quickly, and then maybe if you have a take on that. There's a new animal. It's called the National Popular Register. Now we are told it's always been there, but now it's becoming, it's gaining currency. Now you, as much as you read, you get more confused. It says everybody's saying NPR is the new NRC. What is it? Is it going to be asking for birth certificates, my birth certificates, my parents' birth certificates? I mean, how is it going to play out? What is it?
So the government has not been very transparent about this, but let's explain from first principles. The National Population Register, NPR, is a product of rules which are kind of subsidiary rules to the Citizenship Act. The Citizenship Act itself does not talk about NPR. So there is a big question mark as to how rules can formulate a policy like the creation of an NPR when the purpose of rules is to give effect to something that is stated in the parent law. So I think a robust challenge to the ultra-virus even of NPR, I don't think the NPR would survive. But let's say for a moment that NPR is being operationalized. In the earlier iterations, it was simply, one which focused on counting residents. Even now, the stated purpose is that. But NPR, in the way in which the rules envisage, NPR creates a basic database of every resident in India. While enumerating the residents, the enumerator is supposed to ask them for information from which you can gauge whether they are likely to be citizens or not. Some babu, some bureaucrat will then look at the NPR register, look at what supporting documentation the enumerator has been able to gather from each person, and then create two lists, one of citizens and one of doubtful citizens. Right? So, likely millions of people are going to find their name in the list of doubtful citizens, either because they weren't there when the enumerator came, or because they didn't show whatever documents they had, or maybe they didn't have them, or maybe they didn't have the full set. And chances are, and this is where things actually happen on the ground, right? That the subjective assessment of the enumerator and the subjective assessment of the bureaucrat will determine who gets into which list on the basis of what kind of documentation. So I'm willing to wager that somebody with a very obviously Muslim name who has an incomplete set of documents will, with a much greater degree of probability, end up in the list of doubtful citizens.
So Aman Wadud is a lawyer from Assam.
Yeah.
He has pointed out after reading of the rules, the NPR rules, that they will also allow private citizens to make complaints about another citizen.
Absolutely.
And then the onus will be on that person who's been named.
So that's in the NRC process, right? So the way it happens is that the NPR will be mined, right? So the data set will be mined by district level officials to create an NRC. Those who, and both lists, those who make it to the NRC and those who are doubtful citizens, these names will be public, and any individual can challenge or vouch. Right? So let's say there's somebody you don't like who's made it to the NRC. You can go and file a complaint that this person is actually not Indian, and set in motion a whole investigative process where the person will have to furnish all kinds of documents. And likewise, as the government says, if you are on the list of doubtful citizens and you don't have a complete set of papers, you could presumably find somebody local to say, "Nahi, he's Indian," and then that process of vouching may get you off the hook. But nowhere does the government actually explain in a transparent manner what they are trying to do. And this is the dishonesty of the whole thing.
I just want to ask you, the Prime Minister and the Home Minister, they have said more than once, and so have other functionaries in the government, that the NRC does not aim to target, or the CAA does not aim to target Muslims, Indian Muslims. They have sought to reassure Indian Muslims that they will not be targeted by the CAA. They are not in its scope. So, should we believe them? I mean, it seems that people are not believing them on this.
Look, the issue is not whether we can believe one or not. I mean, the issue is, for example, with the NPR, and the Bengal government was one of the first to stand up and say that we will not allow this to happen in Bengal. And like Sid pointed out, it is, if you look at the way the question is set up, when we had the census before this and we got the NPR, there are two questions in the NPR, for example. One is, what is your father and mother's date of birth? And second, their place of birth. Now, for example, someone in my district, most of the Hindus in my district, I would say more than 50% of them, have had one parent born in Bangladesh, because Nadia was part of the Kushtiya, undivided Kushtiya district, then divided into. So now, for example, if I am a person who's living in, and you ask me, my mother was born in 1948 in what is now Bangladesh, then that automatically puts me into, say, the doubtful list. In the doubtful list. Now then it is up, for example, we've seen in India, if you have a spelling error in a PAN card or a spelling error in an Aadhaar card, and if you are a PLU, a person like us, it's I would say, frustrating enough and difficult enough for people like us who have access to resources, who have access to so many things. But it is so very difficult for people on the ground if there's one spelling error. And I've seen it now on the ground where people have got worried, and you've got these huge lines outside the State Bank of India, outside Allahabad Bank, in almost every district headquarter in India today, where people before would not bother about if there was a spelling error in any document. Now they've got the fear of God in it. And the fact that they're scared something's going to happen, this fear is coming. So once this fear psychosis comes in, it doesn't matter what the Prime Minister is saying or what the Home Minister is saying. It really doesn't matter. It's fear which is driving people. And I think there's something that the accountants who are allies of the current BJP said in Parliament, Prakash Singh Badal and Sukhbir Singh Badal said that. He says, anything that will make an Indian today have to stand in queue to prove that they're Indians is not something we can agree with. And I think fundamentally, that is the crux of the matter. Anything that makes us all stand in line to prove that we're Indian, we're sorry we can't be part of that.
I mean,
can I just go ahead? Yes, this myth that Shah and Modi keep saying that no Indian will be affected, right? I can think of hundreds of scenarios where Indians will be. For example, let us say that there is a Bengali Hindu woman, Indian citizen, and who marries a Bangladeshi Hindu man, who the state regards as a migrant. Okay, that's one couple, right? And there is a Muslim Indian woman, let's say from West Bengal, who marries a Muslim Bangladeshi migrant. And both of these couples produce children, right? Under the Citizenship Act, which defines the child is entitled to Indian citizenship only if at least one parent is Indian and the other parent is not an illegal migrant. Right? So two children born in India at the same time, the CAA process will render one of them effectively stateless. And okay, you can say, well, the child is not Indian by law, but what if it renders one Indian woman who is married to somebody, as it disrupts her family life because she happens to be Muslim, and the other Indian woman who happens to be Hindu is unaffected. So, there are lots of scenarios that, so it's patently, and I'm not even going into the wider normative or philosophical issue, the affront that is perpetrated when you make religion a criterion and then you exclude some religions, right? And as a thought experiment, if you were to say that, let's say the IB or RAW were to tell the government that, hang on a minute, it's too dangerous to allow any Pakistani Christian or any Pakistani Hindu to come because, some of them may have been made into agents or whatever. So let's have a language test. That apart from being one of these 5 religions, your mother tongue must be, and there's a list of languages, and it includes all the Indian languages, but it leaves out Odia. Won't Odias be up in arms? Saying, what kind of a CA is this? Are we not Indian? Is our language not Indian? And for Shah and Modi not to grasp this.
Siddharth, I want to throw it open to people also, but just...
Okay, also one point on
this. Let's throw it open because people have lots of questions.
There's one for example, when they come in and say it doesn't, to go to sort of second his example, say for example, today if you are, let's say 2 illegal migrants, you're illegal, I'm illegal, you're Hindu, I'm Muslim. Now, if you're both illegal migrants today, and in that we have come over before the cut-off date of 14 or whatever it is, under the CAA, if I am Hindu, I only have to wait 6 years before I can apply. If you are Muslim, you have to wait at least 11 years before you can apply. Yes, that is what it is. Now, if I'm an illegal migrant and you're an illegal migrant, then we have both broken or are in violation of the same sections of the Passport Act and the Foreigners Act. But I get redress in less time than you do. So then there's something fundamentally wrong with that, in so many ways.
I just want to run past both of you before we throw it open to them. It's very clear to the Muslim community in India, this is something of a black and white issue for them. The last person they are telling us, we believe this law, CAA plus NRC, is only aimed at making us stateless and turning us into foreigners. I just want to ask both of you, do you think, is that overblown on their part? Do you think they are overreacting? But that's what they are thinking. That's what they are saying. It's very clear.
You see, I fall back on Amit Shah's famous words. Chronology samajhiye. Right? So CAA is not CAA by itself. If it was just the CAA, it's possible people may have said, "Chalo, this is not good, not great, but okay, we can live with it." But the CAA comes bundled with NRC, and it comes bundled with Mr. Shah's rhetoric about Deemak ko nikalna hai, and it comes bundled with 95 years of RSS philosophy, which says Muslims are not Indians, right? So it is natural for somebody to feel that they are being targeted. Even if you ask me as an analyst, it is not practical in the 21st century for any government or any bigoted person to think that you can drive 200 million people into the Bay of Bengal. You cannot lock up 200 million people. Bangladesh says they're not our people, we're not going to take them. So what's the game plan? I think the game plan is possibly that through this process to disenfranchise either permanently or temporarily a good number of people who never vote for you, right? And it's not just Muslims, by the way. Like if Amit Shah's chronology is implemented eventually, then Adivasis don't have adequate papers, and they also are not enthusiastic BJP voters. Dalits don't have papers in the same way. So if you look at the caste and class analysis, look at the region. I was in Nagpur recently, and a couple of actors were telling me that in Maharashtra you have the nomadic community, which is quite sizable, and none of them have any documents of any kind, right? So they will not pass that NRC hurdle of yours, but they don't vote for BJP, so maybe put them in the doubtful citizen camp for 5 years. I mean, not camp, doubtful citizen category, take away the right to work, right to vote, but they will carry on working because the political economy is still, economically you still need them to do their labor and no wages and so on and so forth. But just take away the right to vote. Maybe that's the game plan.
That's exactly, I said this earlier also, I said there's no end game. What's the end game? Mr. Balu of the DMK stood up and he said, what is the end game? When Bangladesh has said we're not going to take anyone back, and the problem is not with Pakistan, the problem is with Bangladeshis. They keep bringing up Bangladesh all the time. And what's the end game? Because Bangladesh has said we're not taking anyone back. And Mr. Modi's actually time and again said we're not sending anyone over. So if Bangladesh is not taking anyone back and you're not sending anyone over, what is the end game? There is no end game. I don't think they've really thought of an end game. It's just to create this, to consolidate their vote bank. And one of the things that just strikes me about this government, we've had governments before this, but usually when I'm fighting an election, I want to get as many people in the room to my side. And I think before this, we've always had governments that try and get as many people to vote for them. Now some of them might like you more, you may succeed, you may not succeed, that's something else. This is for the first time a government that does not care about a certain, they don't want everyone to vote for them, they just don't want it, they don't care. They're going to say we're 78% Hindu, we don't care what happens to the remaining 22%, we take our 78%, out of that, if we can get a sort of a staunch 50% of that, so that's 35%, we are good to go. And that's all they're doing. I was in Parliament last week and we had Sahib Singh Barma's son Parvesh who stood up and he says, Jai Shri Ram Bolo, he tells Subodh Roy, who's parliamentarian for my party, just across the aisle like that. He says, Jai Shri Ram Bolo, aap sabke paap dhul jayenge. And I'm Hindu and I'm sitting there thinking, you're standing up in Parliament and saying that. I can imagine saying that in a street corner. But to say that in Parliament, as a Hindu, I found it offensive. The fact that chanting this would somehow cleanse us all. And I don't think previous to this that we had lived in a world where it would be not only okay, but applauded and lauded. And I think that's what's happened. They don't care. They generally don't care.
Also, as Siddharth said, there is the ideology of Hindutva going back to Savarkar's treatise in 1923 and the founding of the RSS. For decades after decades, all they have said is Muslims and Christians and communists are foreigners. This is not their holy land. This is not their fatherland. That kind of rhetoric has been sort of amplified over the decades. Do you think that rhetoric needs to be challenged or not in India?
The very fact that we're all here today and we're living as Indians, I think is challenging enough.
Siddharth, would you like to have a last go on that?
This ideology and philosophy is deeply anti-people, anti-Indian. It has to be opposed, and people are opposing and fighting it.
Okay, thank you. So let me ask for questions. Very short, as Jaspal said at the beginning. Very short questions with a question mark at the end. Yes, please go ahead.
I just have a question.
Can you stand up, please, and speak a little louder?
So So I'm a little confused about the about who is an Indian from documents standpoint. As in, we have heard a lot that most people don't have birth certificates. What else is it that they have which makes them an Indian? I have my passport, which is like recognized all over the world. It was made through due process, but now they're saying they won't accept that passport as a sign of my citizenship. What should somebody like me do? For example, if I didn't have a birth certificate, what would the rest of the country do?
Sure. Thank you.
You know, the truth is that, and we've asked this question to the government, they don't have an answer. They're saying we will say it in due course when the NRC, if NRC is ever implemented. And and they have given false information out through whenever you see a story which says NHA officials say, and it doesn't name who this official is, you should switch on your bullshit meter and say that this is they're just making this stuff up. Last week somebody some NHA official planted a story because the question was, okay, you have the CAA, how will you know who is a Hindu? Right? Because the fact is that there is no government document. Which so nothing prevents Motuzur Rahman from saying I'm a Hindu, right? And how do you prove that he's not a Hindu? And so this so-called unnamed official said, no, we will look at the Aadhaar card. No, Aadhaar card doesn't have religion, right? And it didn't occur to the reporter to tell them, I don't know religion. There's no religion on the Aadhaar, so they don't know. And I think you have a point. The Mahua, she said. The game is really to polarize. So they, if you're not really serious about this, and the reason you aren't is because there's so many practical difficulties in doing it. But if you just create division, create polarization, create insecurity and fear in the minds of Muslims, so that they will just and other people who feel they may be disenfranchised or their rights may be assailed in some way, then maybe that's the goal. Because there is no, Mr. Shah keeps saying, ऐसा कोई country है जहाँ पे एक national register of citizens नहीं है. Well, US doesn't have an NRC. There's a fight going on here as to whether the census should count just residents as it does, or can begin to at least count citizens, because the US government doesn't know how many US citizens live in the US. And I don't think the US is any the poorer for that. Quite frankly.
And also in the US, the law is very clear. Regardless of your parents' status, if you are born in the US, you are a US citizen. That also works that way. Okay, let's get the next question right at the back there. Yes. Please speak a little louder.
Yeah, good evening. I just have a question on the basic fundamentals of this law and how it affects Hindus specifically. So there are two situations. One is a Hindu who has come from Pakistan or Bangladesh, living as a refugee, and he would be given Indian citizenship as per the CA. However, if there is a Hindu in India who has not come from Pakistan or Bangladesh and he has no papers, as per the law, will he be put in a detention center, or just because he's a Hindu, he'll be forgiven?
Okay, thank you.
That's a good question. Okay, the first is when you're talking about the law is hazy on both counts. So the first is when you say that you're a Hindu and you've come in. So when we passed the CAA now, but you have to remember it came in 2012, right? Before this, when was it? When it was first, it was brought in, it was passed in the Lok Sabha, didn't have the numbers in the Rajya Sabha. Was it 15 or 12?
2014.
2014 is when they brought it in. So when they went in, it went to a joint select committee. And there's a 438-page report of the Joint Select Committee, which I've read. And in that report, the director of the IB was made to depose as a witness. And it's in the report, and it said since India became independent, the last 70 years, only 33,000 odd people have come in. Hindus have come in and said that they're refugees. At the time of entry, did they say that they had put persecution as a reason? Right? So even according to Indian government, there are only 33,000 Hindus who have come in from any other country claiming religious persecution. You must understand that.
The law also doesn't have persecution.
It doesn't have persecution, but when you say that you're fleeing and you're Hindus, then that's the reason that they've given for putting in this law in the first place. Right? Which is why people are saying that you could have, what about Ahmadiyas, what about Rohingyas, what about everybody else, number one. So you've got to say at the time of coming in. And the other thing is, if your father came in before 71 and he claimed he was persecuted and he is now dead, how are you going to prove that somebody was persecuted? So how do you claim it? There's nothing, it's completely shades of grey. So there's no way to know. When you read that committee report, it's very clear. The second thing, when you ask that you could be a poor person, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, anybody, which is what's happened in Assam. And if you don't have papers, you're Hindu. Out of that, there were 12 lakh people out of the 19 lakh in the final NRC list, which is exactly in Group B, like you said, where they didn't have papers. And yes, if you don't have papers, then you go to a detention center according to what the law is. So, yes, you don't know. So this CAA will give you an automatic A, how do you prove that you're Hindu? B, if you don't have papers, you don't have papers. And if there's a law for people without papers, then how is it different if you're Hindu than if you're anybody else? So, I think they really walked into a complete swamp.
There is this joke going on Facebook where people are saying, अब ये किसको पाकिस्तान भेजेंगे, हिंदू को भेजेंगे, वो फिर चलाएगा सीधे.
But the bottom line is that this law is just for 3 countries and for these 5 religions. So, say a Hindu Rohingya from Myanmar, and there are Hindu Rohingyas, would not be eligible. And similarly, Hindus who come post 2014 would not be eligible. And I think one has not hammered away enough at this, that what India needs actually is a proper refugee policy. And incidentally, if there's only 33,000 Hindus who